When I first read this remark on Amia Srinivasan's collection of essays, I was intrigued, and it led me to read her work. Certainly, we think plenty about sex in one sense, but Salai is right. We don't think enough about sex philosophically. So, in this lecture, we'll follow Srinivasan's lead and philosophize about this most intimate aspect of the human experience, sex. Life can be beautiful, it can be ugly, it can be pleasurable and painful. Who knows the meaning behind the agony and the ecstasy? I don't. If I could channel Aphrodite and Dionysus, perhaps I could provide some meaningful insights into everything that sex, intoxication, and the arts say about us as people. And that's what this discussion is about. Our chapter is on sexual ethics, but sex is not a clear concept distinguishable from all others. Sex is like art. I, like others, will often divide the basic branches of philosophy into logic, metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. But axiology could more properly be substituted for ethics, since it entails both ethics and aesthetics. Axiology is concerned with value. I won't attempt to give a crash course in aesthetics, but one central question is, what is art? Like sex, different people will have different answers. And this is where different kinds of relativism and subjectivism or perspectivism show their appeal. For some people, art must be self-expression. But for an artist who spends hours pouring their heart and skill into a piece, ensuring that it fits the golden ratio, might look at the infamous R. Mutt work and say, this is bullshit. Art can inspire love, hate, and other emotions among people, and some people will consider much different things art. The same is true of sex. From my limited perspective, sex seems to be at the top of the pleasure and meaning hierarchy of intimate human experiences, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Nietzsche might agree with me in saying that sex is, or seems to be, the antithesis of death or dying. And Freud might agree that sex is a primary motivation behind everything we do as people. I don't know if I agree, but Plato might say that all these things are just distractions of the body and it's best to do away with them. Nietzsche would call this a life-denying view, I think. And he would accuse any religiously or most religiously motivated views of the same. But I think we're all different. Like art, people believe on a spectrum. Some people will have a very open perspective on what sex is, and others will have a very restrictive view. And there will be people with ideas in between. Any act of expression and intimacy can be sex for some people. Sex can start with a hug or a handshake and last for months of social interaction until it culminates in anything more your imagination can conjure. But for others, sex is only coitus, the union of male and female genitalia. Like art, on one end of the spectrum, almost anything can be sex. On the other end, only one specific act is sex. With this recognition, it seems that all we know is that we know nothing about sex itself except what sex is to us. But, as we'll see later, even this may be difficult. And that's how we may have to reason about sex for ourselves. Of course, there are definitions we could adopt, but on one end of the spectrum, the definitions are so rigid they get us into one kind of trouble, being too exclusive, like biological or legal definitions. And on the other end of the spectrum, social or political definitions get us into another kind of trouble, being too inclusive. Different religions, philosophies, cultures, and lifestyles may also be in conflict with each other. But sex is often an intimately social thing, and what sex is isn't limited to our perspectives when partners become involved. I recall a scene from the 1990s film Clerks. A woman confessed to her boyfriend, who believed she had a low body count or something, that she had had a lot of oral sex partners. Even though in her mind oral sex didn't count, it made him furious, and he was extremely judgmental. That scene illustrates pretty well the different views on sex that different people can have. It also illustrates what jerks people can be. From one perspective, I could be a virgin, for example. From another, I'm extremely promiscuous. And once two people become involved with each other, their ideas of sex may change together towards a stronger compatibility, or perhaps they'll clash and repulse. But maybe we'll return to this later. I began this lecture with some commentary on Srinivasan's collection of essays entitled The Right to Sex, because, as you've noticed, most of the ideas we've discussed in this class have been attributed to men. And in the history of philosophy, just like in modern thought, sex has been underexamined. We get some ideas from Plato's Symposium. Aristotle endorses moderation. Kant seems to think it's disgusting. And Mill might be committed to whatever kind of sex is consensual and maximizing. But these are all limited conceptions and analyses of sex. Srinivasan's analyses are sophisticated, eloquent, and thought-provoking. Compared to the old works we've been focusing on, Srinivasan's work is as refreshing as it is intellectual. Her work serves to elucidate many ramifications, implications, and conceptions of sex that lead to more important questions than to explicit conclusions, but these are valuable in their own right. But this book isn't as limited as this lecture needs to be. It covers a wide range of topics in feminism, porn, sex work, assault, capitalism, and incarceration. Her work is new to me, so I might get something wrong, and I apologize to her if I do, but I'm going to share it anyway, and I hope you take up her work for yourself and come to your own conclusions. Our text opens this chapter with some interesting quotes from Philip Roth and Alan Goldman. The first, from Roth, is one of almost poetic reverence for sex. He says, "Only when you have sex are you most cleanly alive and most cleanly yourself. Sex isn't just friction and shallow fun. Sex is also the revenge on death. Don't forget death. Don't ever forget it. Yes, sex too is limited in its power. But tell me, what power is greater?" The opening remark, selected from Goldman, is less whimsical, but similarly ethically charged. Goldman claims, "There is no morality intrinsic to sex, although general moral rules apply to the treatment of others in sex acts, as they apply to all human relationships." What I take Goldman to mean here is sex conceived of independently from all other aspects, such as consent, age, safety, to list a few, is amoral on its own. That is, if a sex act is moral or immoral, then it's not due to the fact that it's a sex act, but the circumstances surrounding the act. For example, the act may be immoral if it hurts someone emotionally, if it's non-consensual, unsafe, or on account of some other factor. Of course, as we'll see, there are challenges to this claim, but as usual, in the end, it'll be up to you to determine the merits of this and other views we'll discuss in this lecture. In 2017, a church governing body in Europe was to vote on whether same-sex couples could be blessed in church, leading John Milbank to tweet, "There is no need to demand celibacy in gay relationships. That wrongly equates same-sex physical affection with full sex." Milbank could have been making a theological point, but it's easy to understand why anyone from the LGBTQ+ community would consider this hate speech. So, what is sex? In this restrictive sense, only vaginal intercourse between a man and a woman constitutes sex. This makes concepts like technical virginity possible, in which young people can justify as much oral, anal, or whatever other kinds of sex they want, and still claim to be virgins with a clear conscience. To some, who maintain this restrictive view of what sex is, this may seem reasonable, but others may find the idea ridiculous. A student once summed up this attitude concisely. She said, "Technical virginity my ass." Our text questions the viability of coitus as a definition in light of some of these technical details and common intuitions. Clearly, this would lead to the impossibility of homosexual sex. Anything pursued could only be described as acts of sex-like intimacy. However, the impossibility of gay sex doesn't only seem intuitively false, it makes the belief in technical virginity potentially homophobic and even transphobic. Our text has us consider another scenario. A woman asks her partner if he is a virgin, and he says, "Yes, I am. I've only been involved in homosexual penetrative intercourse." She may be perplexed, as our text says, but her idea of sex could be anything. If she believes in technical virginity, she may be relieved, but she may also think that this is a misuse of the term virgin and be disappointed, or maybe even excited, who knows. After all, as our text says, anal sex is sex, and I would guess that this is a common intuition that maintainers would need explained away. So, as it appears, this initial definition of coitus may be incomplete. When someone is asked if they had sex, or if they had sex with someone in particular, they may answer, kind of, or, well, it depends, or some other kind of qualification. Some people won't count levels of foreplay as sex, for example, or oral as sex, or even sex with a condom as sex because the condom's making the contact and not the genitals, or whatever. And some young people will even practice soaking, and still somehow consider themselves virgins. At any rate, our text concludes this section with the acknowledgement that the question, what is it to have sex, is not exactly straightforward. But try to keep these various definitions in mind as we consider different problems, questions, and ethical theories. And ask yourself how shifts in definition can affect these questions and theories. Another view from outside the big three we'll consider in this lecture is natural law theory. St. Thomas Aquinas' natural law theory is composed of 4 interconnected laws: eternal law, natural law, human law, and divine law. Let's set out these laws in order to make sense of this overarching theory. Recall that God is always and everywhere, that is, omnipresent. Eternal law refers to God's rational plan for everything, so it's in the mind of God. God being eternal, anything God has in mind is also eternal and everywhere. Aquinas, as a teleologist inspired by Aristotle, believes everything has a purpose and follows a plan. Recall our previous discussion of Aristotle's teleology and his argument for eudaimonia through reason as the telos of humans. Aquinas agrees with Aristotle that reason reveals our telos, or purpose, as humans, but goes one step further. Not only does fulfilling our purpose well make anything or anyone good, fulfilling our purpose is also to act in accordance with God's plan, the eternal law. The natural law is the harmony that results from anyone fulfilling their purpose. In other words, if we act in accordance with reason, then we're partaking in natural law. Through reason, Aquinas believes that we can discover or agree upon some general rules that he referred to as primary precepts. His first primary precept is that good must be pursued and evil must be avoided. This precept should guide and inform all of our moral decision-making. This is a natural law because it is obvious to us through reason. Other such natural laws that Aquinas identified are that we ought to protect and preserve human life, reproduce and educate our offspring, know and worship God, live in a society, very Aristotelian there. Aquinas considers these primary because everyone can figure them out by reason alone, and they apply to everyone. Thus, they're consistent with natural law. Human law is law as we usually conceive of it, and made up of what Aquinas calls secondary precepts. Secondary precepts, like federal and local laws, aren't necessarily moral in nature. Recall our earlier discussion on the difference between morality and legality. What is legal isn't always moral, and what's illegal isn't always immoral. For a human law to be morally good, it must be in accordance with natural law. Our text gives the example of women driving in Saudi Arabia, which was until recently illegal. Though this is no longer the case, there are places in the Middle East that are quite patriarchal, meaning their societies and governments are controlled by men and typically, from a Western or American perspective, controlled unjustly in favor of men. Our text could have used other examples, such as face veils or legal requirements for women to have male guardians, usually their fathers or brothers. People find these things sexist and oppressive too, but our text went with the driving example. Aquinas would maybe say that all these examples go against the natural law because if we reason about them, we should see that they impose different standards based on arbitrary differences such as sex and gender. So the patriarchal laws are inconsistent with the natural law and are thus immoral. Think back to that later. Any laws that people think are good but go against natural law only appear good, thus Aquinas' terminology, apparent good. A real good is when secondary precepts or human laws conform to natural law. Aquinas believes we can discover laws in at least two ways: through reason, as we've already seen, and through revelation. It's by revelation that we learn the divine law. Divine law is what God reveals to us through scriptures, such as the Quran or the Bible. As said in previous lectures, a theory is teleological when the good of something is determined by how well it achieves its end, purpose, or function. The natural law theory, being teleological, then must answer the question, what is sex for, in order to determine what good sex is? On the natural law theorist's view, the one true function of sex is procreation. It feels good only to facilitate that end. Therefore, sex is only morally good if it facilitates the end of procreation, and morally bad if it frustrates procreation. A natural law theorist is therefore committed to the position that masturbation, pornography, contraception, and other than heterosexual acts are morally wrong. Masturbation and pornography are morally wrong since they're self-centered and frustrate procreation, as does contraception. Typically, other than heterosexual acts have no tendency towards procreation either and are, therefore, on this view, morally wrong also. Our text proceeds to give some brief clarification on common misconceptions of what this theory stipulates. For example, the difference between misuse and disuse. That is, using something improperly is not the same as not using it at all, so celibacy is morally permissible. However, the text gives examples of behaviors that frustrate natural ends, but do not seem to have any moral implications, such as walking on your hands despite having functioning legs and feet. Of course, the natural law theorist may argue that walking on your hands is not intended to frustrate the ends of our legs and feet. The intention is merely to do something else with our hands. However, if the intention is to frustrate those ends, then they may be committed to the conclusion that always walking on your hands may be immoral. However, the claim is not that something is wrong because it's unnatural. So the use of medications, toys, fantasies, and diverse sex acts may be morally permissible so long as they lead to intentional procreation. While this theory was historically motivated by religion, our text points out that similar conclusions could be arrived at through atheistic arguments motivated by evolutionary biology. However, from the perspective of evolutionary biology, we may have prospered as a species because pleasurable sex naturally led to more procreation, not that it's pleasurable because it leads to procreation. A further difficulty for this view that has come up frequently since Lecture 1 is the is-ought fallacy, or the is-ought gap. That is, just because it's a frustration of sexual faculties to use contraception, it doesn't follow that people ought not use contraception. Another way to say that is, just because sex does lead to pregnancy, it doesn't mean that sex ought to lead to pregnancy. Before proceeding with our text to the other moral lenses, let's practice using the natural law theorist lens to evaluate a thought experiment. Imagine a husband and wife are trying to become pregnant, but the husband can't climax without some sex act that violates primary precepts of natural law or divine law. The entire encounter would be completely antithetical to natural law theory until the final moments leading to conception, whether that be by quickly changing acts or performing them in a way that it leads to pregnancy. How is the natural law theorist supposed to conclude that whatever morally depraved sex acts you're comfortable imagining are morally permissible if they ultimately lead to intentional pregnancy? There is a principle on this view called the doctrine of double effect, and it states that an act violating a primary precept can be morally acceptable if it also meets the following four criteria. The act must be a good one. The act must come about before the consequences. The intention must be good. And lastly, the reasons must be serious. Strangely, it seems that in this scenario, the act may be a good one since married couples presumably ought to have children, so that satisfies the first criterion. Criterion 2 seems to be satisfied since the only consequences of the act are pregnancy, and perhaps a guilty conscience, depending on what the act was that led to the climax and how they felt about it once the excitement had subsided, or whatever. 3 also seems to be satisfied since the intention of the act was to fulfill the function of sexual faculties, as demanded by natural law theory. And finally, since having children is momentous, and the scriptures say to be fruitful and multiply or something, the reasons for the act also appear serious, thus satisfying criterion number 4. This is indeed a strange consequence of the theory if we've interpreted it and applied it correctly. This harkens back to some of our text's earlier questions regarding sex. For example, in the first section of this chapter, our text asked, what is the role of pleasure in defining sex? Since whatever the couple was doing could potentially have culminated in only one moment of coitus, could we rightly say that the wife had sex? We can see what the role of pleasure is for the husband on this view, since without that, conception would be impossible. But what, on this view, is the role of the female orgasm? It certainly isn't necessary for pregnancy. If it has no function, does this mean that homosexual acts are only morally impermissible for men? Furthermore, if on this view the female orgasm is unimportant, this view may not only be trans and homophobic, but perhaps also chauvinistic and sexist. However, it doesn't follow from the fact that because we don't like a conclusion, that conclusion isn't correct. But the many issues we discover in the course of our analysis do give us reason to question this theory's viability. Srinivasan's work serves as a critique to views like natural law theory, other oppressive religious theories, and theories that place women in a subordinate relationship to men, what Simone de Beauvoir might call the slavery of half of humanity. In her work, The Second Sex, she argues that once this oppressive, hypocritical system is abolished, couples can finally discover their true form, not only in sex, but in all relationships as equals. Srinivasan's critique addresses what may be the origins of this inequality. She claims that women are born into a class of people assigned to an inferior social status on the basis of something called sex, a thing that is said to be natural, pre-political, an objective material ground on which the world of human culture is built. We inspect this supposedly natural thing, sex, only to find that it's already value-laden with meaning. At birth, bodies are sorted as male and female. This originary division determines what social purposes a body will be assigned. In Aquinas and Aristotle's terms, the body's telos. Srinivasan continues, some of these bodies are for creating new bodies, for washing and clothing and feeding other bodies, out of love, never duty, for making other bodies feel good, and feel whole and in control, for making other bodies feel free. Sex is, then, a cultural thing posing as a natural one. In a world full of societies, religions, and other systems historically created and run by men, doesn't it seem possible that these roles and oppressive double standards are the result of the ruler's preferences? Of course, there are more historical and biological factors that we could consider as well, but Srinivasan's point seems clear, and the way she points it out almost seems obvious. Our sex appears to be value-laden with meaning that is not completely natural or pre-political, and we can see that in natural law theory. Sex in the sense of something that we do with our bodies. Natural law theory, like other social forces, attempts to influence and regulate. These theories and social forces attempt to tell us what kinds of sex are permissible, who we can have it with, when it's appropriate, and for what reasons we might pursue it. As Srinivasan describes the dictates of the tyrannical social forces, some bodies are for other bodies to have sex with. Some bodies are for the pleasure, the possession, the consumption, the worshipping, the servicing, the validating of other bodies. Sex in this second sense is also said to be a natural thing, a thing that exists outside of politics. Feminism shows that this too is a fiction, and a fiction that serves certain interests. With what little we have available to us in our text covering Kant's incredibly dense theories, our analysis of his views on sex will be unfortunately limited. However, as our text admits, even the greatest Kant scholars are still not sure how to understand his ideas on sex. With that said, the Kantian lens we've molded in this class so far should be sufficient to give us a rudimentary understanding or overview of Kant's thoughts on the morality of sex. Kant's view does not seem overtly religious, though it possibly has religious motivations. Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, once described Kant as an underhanded Christian, or a Christian in disguise. However, if we keep within the theoretical framework we've discussed so far, we can see that his views on sex are based on the second formulation of the categorical imperative. That is, act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. Kant is what Alan Sobel called a sexual pessimist, that is, someone who sees human sexuality as undignified in general. Sexual pessimism, again, is a view that Nietzsche would describe as life-denying, because it discounts an essential part of physical and emotional human life. A life-affirming view, in Nietzsche's language, is what Sobel calls sexual optimism, in which sex is befitting a healthy and moral life. However, from Kant's pessimistic view, sexual desire is the only natural impulse that takes someone else's body as an object of indulgence, that is, as a means to the end of sexual gratification. Since this doesn't treat the desired person as a whole person, sexual desire and intercourse are immoral. However, in the context of marriage, Kant thinks that sexual desire ceases to objectify people. This is a consequence of Kant's conception of marriage. Kant says that marriage is an agreement between two people by which they grant each other equal reciprocal rights, each of them undertaking to surrender the whole of their person to the other with a complete right of disposal over it. So, according to this conception of marriage, objectification and using one's partner as merely a means to an end ceases, because there's a kind of reciprocity in the marriage through which partners are treated as whole persons in sex. As Sobel explains, because the acquisition of another through sex in marriage is reciprocal, each person regains his or her personhood, and hence does not lose it after all. When I surrender myself to you, you thereby acquire me. By you also surrendering yourself to me, I thereby acquire you, which you includes the me that I have acquired. We each surrender, but then reacquire ourselves. This sounds a bit like the biblical becoming one flesh description of marriage, but that aside, this mutual and simultaneous surrendering and acquiring of each other somehow maintains the participants as whole persons. This is a complex view, but one of the immediate questions that will likely come to mind is, why is this reciprocity only possible in heterosexual marriage? Why not in deeply committed relationships? Why not in homosexual marriage? Indeed, when considering homosexual marriage through Kant's ethical lens, how is this restriction justified? It doesn't seem to violate the categorical imperative in any of its formulations. For categorical imperative 1, the maxim, marry the one you love, does not seem contradictory. For the second formulation, it's not clear how homosexual marriage does not treat each person as ends in themselves. And again, why doesn't the reciprocity that makes sex morally permissible for heterosexual married couples do the same for homosexual married couples? Without knowing the religious or theoretical explanations for these issues, it's difficult to use this ethical lens for evaluating the morality of sex. Was all sex immoral before men dreamt up the marriage contract? Is marriage just another oppressive institution used to subordinate women and control their social value, like some feminist organizations claim? For more detailed questions and analysis, I'll recommend again Srinivasan's The Right to Sex. But, even though the book is short, it gets a lot more complicated and in-depth than our analysis here. At any rate, Kant is having a hard time hiding the religious motivations behind his theory on this one, if I'm interpreting it correctly. In the next lecture on sexual ethics, we'll cover our remaining moral theories, utilitarianism and virtue ethics, while continuing to inform our conversation with Srinivasan's insights, and end with a brief treatment on the contemporary moral problems posed by pornography and sex work.